Welcome to the Wind from the West podcast, a podcast dedicated to supporting pastors on the journey of renewing declining churches. Together, we'll explore insights, strategies, and hard-learned lessons as we work to help pastors transition to healthier ministry models. So let's cultivate healthy congregations, foster faithful communities, and renew the joy of serving in pastoral leadership. I'm Tanner Griffin, and I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, friends. Welcome to the first episode of Wind from the West podcast. My name is Tanner Griffin. I am your host. Thanks for joining me as we start out on this adventure together. This is a podcast that is designed to reach pastors, church leaders, or anybody who just cares about the church in its current state and future of the church. And so it's a bit of a niche audience, but I know there's a lot of people that are concerned and anxious about church, whether it be their local church, their denomination, or just the general direction of church in our day and age. And so if that's one of you, welcome. This podcast is designed to be a place for conversation and encouragement and provide some resources for pastors and church leaders as we navigate this difficult season in the life of the church. And I think it goes without saying, if you're paying attention to church culture, whether it be through statistics or just anecdotal evidence, maybe you look around on Sunday morning and there's not as many people as there used to be. Maybe programs are struggling, ministries are struggling because the resources that once funded those programs aren't there anymore. Maybe look around and there's not as many young families, kids at the church as there once was. Whatever you might be seeing, there's definitely some real challenges that the local church is facing these days. And because of that, there's a lot of pressure, local church pastors and the leadership, along with the denominational leaders or other ministry leadership. And so I'm not one to focus on attendance numbers and how much money is in an offering plate, but if you just use those simple metrics, there's some serious challenges in the local church. But I think it goes beyond that, and so we find ourselves trying to navigate this season, trying to figure out what should we be doing in the moment and what should we be planning for in the future. And so that's kind of what we're hoping to do here with Wind from the West. I've served in ministry in several capacities over the last few decades. I've been around the church my whole life, and I have a love and a concern and an optimism towards the future of the church. And so all that shows up kind of in this project. The frustration side is just the sense that the world is changing and culture is changing, and the church seems to be reacting and sometimes fighting that change. And there's some things worth fighting, but on the other hand, there's some realities that we just need to acknowledge. And the church can't do what it did 50, 70 years ago and assume that you'll get the same engagement with culture and society around it. The world around us has changed. And so to be faithful to what we're called to do, it may look a little bit different. And having been a senior pastor in a smaller church that had seen some decline over the last few decades, I found myself experiencing the pressure to maintain the status quo, maintain what had been there, while also trying to fix some of the broken things and also at the same time prepare for the future and build a healthy culture and a healthy church. And that's a lot. And so that's kind of where the genesis for this project comes from, is just that sense. I went looking for answers to the problems I was facing, and some places I found some really good answers, and I want to share those with others. Other places there wasn't good answers and kind of maybe needed to get a higher level view of things, maybe look at how things are organized or how the church goes to about its business, and maybe there's some organizational, like fundamental structural things that need to change. But what I thought I was experiencing as an individual pastor turned out to be maybe more universal than what I anticipated. With conversations with my colleagues, fellow pastors, and other church leaders, they were asking the same questions I was. There were similar frustrations, similar pains, similar fears, and we were all kind of looking for answers together. And so that's what this project is going to be, this Wind from the West. I'll explain more in a minute, but there'll be these podcast episodes, there'll be a blog, a resource library, and a social media presence, a Facebook page, hopefully create some engagement and a place for conversation to happen. And that's at least how we're getting started with this project. So you may be saying, okay, that's good. I mean, there's a bunch of podcasts and blogs already out there about church renewal, church revitalization, church culture. Do we really need another one? And like I said a minute ago, been searching for answers to some of the challenges I was facing, and it was as we had these conversations with me and other colleagues that we found ourselves being encouraged and working through some of these issues. And so I just wanted to take that experience and maybe recreate it or broaden the invitation into that conversation. I definitely don't have the answer to all the challenges, but hopefully together we can encourage one another, ask good questions, find answers together, support one another in the moment, but also create a vision for what the local church is going to look like in the future. And so that's more of kind of the what, what's Wind from the West. Maybe now would be a good time to explain what the name means, because it is a significant name. And when I was a sophomore in college, I had the opportunity to travel to Israel with a group from my college as an educational trip. And as a sophomore ministry student, I was overwhelmed for a lot of different reasons on that trip. One of the main reasons I was overwhelmed, though, was just realizing the profound connection between the biblical stories that I knew and had heard my whole life and the physical settings in which they took place. And I had never realized just how important and how much meaning the land and the physical geographical setting shaped the stories, how much of an influence it had on the meaning behind it. And so when I was in Israel and we were reading various stories from the Bible at the sites where they were, where they took place, they had a profound meaning and connection. And so I learned on that trip to pay attention to those things. It's not just background filler information, but that they had that oftentimes the setting, the land, the geography, the rivers, the hills, the mountains, the valleys, the wind, were characters in the story to some extent. So learning to pay attention to those things and read those things as I read the Bible shaped how I understood things. One of the ones that really stuck with me and again kind of shaped this podcast and blog and this project was the idea of wind. And so if you know your biblical Hebrew or Greek, you know that there's connection between the word wind, breath, and spirit. If you're not familiar with that, in Hebrew, ruach, it's the same word for all three, and we translate it into English based off of context. Once you start realizing that wind kind of has echoes of breath and spirit, or when you read spirit, it kind of has echoes of breath and wind, or when you speak of breath, it has echoes of spirit and wind. You start seeing there's a more dynamic meaning in that text, and then you start realizing that the wind, breath, spirit plays a role in these stories that may be more profound than what we're used to. So, for example, the impact of wind on stories. If you start reading your Bible and you hear something about an east wind, a wind from the east, more than likely you're going to hear a story that has to do with death, sickness, famine, destruction, judgment, violence, war. A wind from the east was connected with death and suffering. And if you can imagine a map of Israel, to the east of Israel is dry, arid, rocky territory. And so a wind that would come off of that land into Israel would bring with it hot, dry air that could cause drought, kill crops, bring suffering upon livestock, cause hardship for people, resources dry up. It was connected with that. When a dry wind from the east would come. Also, if you think of who the enemies of Israel were in the Old Testament, oftentimes they came from the east. The armies would come from the east and bring death and destruction. And so there's this connection of this wind from the east being a dry, arid, life-stealing wind, breath, spirit. And what made me think of this is that as I was pastoring in the local church, I felt like that's the wind that was blowing through our culture right now, is this dry, arid wind that was making life difficult. On the contrast, if you can imagine again where Israel sits geographically, to the west is the Mediterranean Sea, and when the wind would come off the Mediterranean, it would bring with it warm, temperate, moist air, and it would cool overnight and bring condensation onto the crops. It would provide rain for the crops. It would allow grasses to grow to feed livestock. It would replenish water reserves. It would bring comfortable environments to do work in. It was a life-giving wind that brought new life and renewal to the region. And so a wind from the east is this wind of death and destruction, but a wind from the west was renewal, revitalization, new life. And so that's kind of the imagery that lays behind this project, is that for the church, I'm hoping that we can see this wind from the west that God is breathing, the Spirit, this wind that is bringing new life and renewal to our churches, not only in the immediate, but also as we navigate church life for the next decade or two. I think there's going to be significant changes in church culture and the way that it relates to its mission field. And so that's wind from the west. And that's where that came from. The project, Wind from the West, is comprised of a blog, these podcasts, a resource library, social media page, and that's what we're starting with, and we'll see what develops from there. But hopefully it becomes a resource and a connection point for church leaders, pastors, as we are doing the work of caring for our congregations, caring for our churches as an organization, meeting the challenges that are present today, but also while we work to create a vision for the church in the future. I don't know what your thoughts are, but I have a strong belief that the church in 20 years is going to look significantly different than it does today. I imagine there'll be larger churches that are more traditional in the sense of what we're used to, and then smaller churches will probably take on a different posture and a different way of doing church, simply because resources and the way communities can function and support the local church. So anyways, that's my take, and I'm optimistic about that. I believe God is breathing new life into our small churches and communities, and has a plan there as well. But the structure of the Wind for the West project, there'll be a blog post that is shaped around a particular theme, and on that post we'll have a list of topics under that theme, and we'll just kind of a high-level discussion of each one of those topics, and then the podcast episodes will be where we get into more detail of each of those. So, for example, let's just say a blog post has 5 topics under a particular theme. We'll release the blog, and then we'll have 5 subsequent podcast episodes that deal with each topic on the blog, and then we'll release another blog episode, another blog post that maybe has 7 topics or 2, and then we'll have the podcast that deals with that. Along with each podcast episode, I'm working to have a shared resource made available, whether it's something that I created in my ministries stuff that I found to deal with challenges or needs, things that people have shared with me, but to create a resource library in which we share out some of them are really simple tools, maybe some other things are just questions that guide us through the challenges and help us name what we're wrestling with, whatever it might be, but hopefully to have resources that we can put in the hands of local church leaders and pastors to help us collectively navigate through some of these challenges. The blog and these resources will be found on my personal webpage. It's tannerhgriffin.com, and then there's a tab for Wind from the West, and all the different options are there. I've already started kind of compiling some of those resources. The podcast, obviously, here wherever you get your podcast episodes from, and then there's a Facebook page, Wind from the West, as well. But that's it. That's what it's about. I'm glad you've listened to this point. If you have and are interested in what we're up to, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to connect with pastors who are doing the good work. If you know of a church leader that's been, air quote, successful in church renewal or revitalization, I'd love to hear from them. If you know of a church or church leadership that is just looking for support, encouragement, resources, community of people to connect with, point them this way. I'd love to build a network of folks that are just there looking out for each other and sharing our wisdom, our burdens, as we collectively try to be faithful to what God has called us to do. I'm optimistic about the future of the church. I'm not doom and gloom. I think the local church is going to be powerful and dynamic and crucial in the future in ways that we probably can't even comprehend right now. But I do think that the local church is going to need equipped and encouraged and empowered local leaders to meet the challenge of going from where we are now to where God is leading us. So I want to do my part to help, and I'm in a season in life in which I'm able to do this. I have the bandwidth and the resources to do this, and I'm happy to share what I've learned and invite others and give them a platform to do that as well. So let me hear from you. What challenges churches are facing, what you think the future of the church has in store, issues that you want us to deal with, and introduce us to folks that need to be connected. I'd love to hear from you. But again, thanks for listening. We'll have another episode coming your way soon. And again, make sure to share it with people that have a passion for the church and want to see it grow healthy and experience that wind from the West. All right, thanks for joining. We'll see you next time.